Hey guys, welcome back. HUK here. Dungeons. Most, if not all, fantasy role-playing games include some sort of dungeon. And a dungeon can technically be the traditional dungeon, or catacombs, or a tavern basement, or a ruin, or a castle. But for the purposes of this video, I am talking about the typical Dungeons and Dragons style dungeon. The vast subterranean maze complex of rooms, treasures, monsters and traps. To me, dungeons are part of the established concept of fantasy role-playing games. This is where you're going to spend most of your time in a lot of adventures for some reason or another. I think probably because they're just easy. As a player, I like dungeons. I like the exploration element if it's done right. You've got a good GM for it. I hate mapping. I hate taking notes as well. I absolutely detest doing that. I always tend to leave that for somebody else. Thankfully, over the last, I'd probably say 10, 15 years, with the advent of like wipe clean grid maps, you don't have to worry too much about mapping the dungeon, because you can just scroll out the relevant bit and play it. Most of the time in the past, I've found that players never ever get the directions you're giving them when you describe it, and I've seen this from both sides of the GM screen. And that's, as a player, I like dungeons, but I hate drawing them. I hate trying to work out exactly what did the GM mean by a hairpin turn or something like that. As a GM, I like dungeons, but I have an issue with them. I have a couple of issues with them. One is repetitiveness. They are, as I say, they are everywhere. And I get to a point, it's all right with a published scenario or a published campaign. But when you're creating your own dungeon, I have this issue where I feel that I'm making rooms up for the sake of it. I always have to include a latrine, because no other bloody dungeon you ever see, or rarely ever see, in a published modular scenario has a dungeon. Has a dungeon lavatory. Words, English, not good. But what rooms do you have? I'm not an advocate of the dungeon ecology. I don't think things need to be 100% set, realistic, but I kind of find rooms do. So you've got your guard room, you've got your alchemist lab, you've got your barracks, but then you have a shrine or a temple or an armory or whatever. But you'll play through a scenario and there'll be like half a dozen empty, pointless rooms. Or you'll have a room, but its only content is a statue on a pedestal. It's not magic, it isn't part of the plot, it doesn't do anything. It's just description. Well, you could have condensed the size of the bloody dungeon if you just got rid of those rooms. Only includes, a few empty rooms here and there, but just get rid of the stuff that's a waste of space. And that bugs me as a GM. Corridors as well. I kind of get the idea that a dungeon needs to be defensible. So having corridors that sort of go odd to prevent an army just charging down the corridors with ease kind of makes sense. But I've seen dungeon layouts where you'll have like a long straight section of corridor, and then it'll do this sort of U shape, but carry on in exactly the same direction it was originally going. And I just look at it and go, what is the frigging point of that? You're just wasting time, my time and the player's time. If it's got nothing to do with an encounter, just have straight bloody corridors, and right angle bends, and rooms that go off at diagonals, so they don't actually fit properly into the bloody squares of the map. Oh, when you've got a game like Pathfinder, for instance, or third edition D&D or whatever that uses this sort of combat system where you're using a grid, it absolutely makes it kind of awkward when you've got odd-shaped rooms and rooms that are diagonal, because then all the terrain and intervening stuff is in the way, because the game doesn't take into account that technically you should just use that room in a normal grid by grid fashion. And things like that bug me to no extent. The other thing that bothers me with dungeons, and this is especially whether it's something that I've come up with or whether it's something that I'm running, is I get bored of the descriptions, because so many rooms are just the same old thing. I start off a dungeon-based session reading the description or flavouring it and what have you. And by halfway into a session, bear in mind, we generally run 4 to 5 hour sessions in our games when they're running. So by about 2 hours, I've given up on this, unless it's got a published written description. I've generally given up, because there's only so much you can describe a room as before they're all exactly the same. And I just get really fed up of it. There isn't enough diversity in room descriptions in modules and adventures. And there's only so much you can do before you're just reiterating the same old crap. And I just say that it's a 15 by 20 rectangular room with a few bits of masonry that's fallen off the walls and ceiling. There's a broken chair in the corner and a blood stain with a dagger in it. When I could have made it that much more interesting, but I've got fed up of spouting the same old sort of description over and over again. It's probably the one area where I think dungeons fail, and why I think they should generally be smaller. Modules like to have these vast dungeons for players to try and level up in, and it's like, yeah, but you're just making it awkward. But to me, with all that, dungeons are very much a vital part of fantasy role-playing games. I think if you can get myself comfortable again, if you can keep a dungeon to a relative size and still achieve what you want out of it, then great. I think that's a good way to do it. And this is more aimed at people who write scenarios, and as well as publish things. Huge, great, sprawling dungeon complexes are not great. You need to keep things to a nice size. Keep pointless rooms out. Keep corridors in a reasonable fashion. And try and make each room different enough that you don't get bored of reading the descriptions out. Anyway, I'm waffling. It's one of those days. What are your thoughts on dungeons? That's mine. I might do another one soon on sort of like wilderness adventures or intrigue scenarios and things like that, and how I think of them. But right now, I'd like to know your thoughts on dungeons. Do you like them? Do you get bored of them? Do you think they're overused, underused? Do you like sprawling dungeon complexes? Let me know in the comments down below and we'll start a discussion. Anyway, until next time, take care, guys. Good gaming.